Welcome to the Brain Guys YouTube channel. It's 1 a.m. where I'm recording from, and I'm going to tell you about the glymphatic system today. So the glymphatic system is very fundamentally the brain's way of clearing debris from its tissue. And whether that debris is, natural byproducts of metabolism or even pathological proteins like the beta amyloid fibers in Alzheimer's, the glymphatic system is responsible for moving that gunk out of the brain and into places where it can be cleared from the CNS, or the central nervous system. So that all being said, I think we can start to orient ourselves towards this figure. You'll see astrocytes in green and neurons in yellow. And what I think you should note is that this ratio of astrocytes to neurons is not reflective of the 1-to-1 glia to neuron ratio that, normally exists in the brain. Astrocytes, though, are the star of the show when it comes to glymphatic system. So for that reason, they're present in kind of a higher abundance than normal in this figure. So that being said, our story is really going to start at the surface of the cerebral cortex with the pia mater, which is one of the meninges, and it basically is the most proximal meninges to the surface of the cerebral cortex. It lies right above it. Above the pia mater, then, is the subarachnoid space, and the subarachnoid space is home to these arteries that kind of transverse the surface of the brain. And during development, signaling cascades induce these arteries to send branches into the deep brain. And that makes sense because the deep brain regions also need their oxygen and they need the CO2 clearance. So these arteries really do need to send circulatory supply down into the brain. What's interesting is the interaction that occurs when an artery comes into contact kind of with the surface of the cerebral cortex and the pia mater. The artery does not puncture the pia mater. It does not break through when it needs to enter the brain. Instead, it induces the pia mater to invaginate around it. And so the pia mater actually follows that artery all the way down into the brain to form a compartment around the artery known as the para-arterial space. And as soon as that compartment forms, CSF from the subarachnoid space flows into that compartment and starts flowing through the para-arterial space. So what you can get then is kind of two concentric tubes. And to imagine that, I'll kind of draw it in here. You have the artery first, containing blood, and around it now you have the para-arterial space containing CSF. So these two concentric tubes are the fundamental architecture of the glymphatic system. Now, the only thing stopping that CSF and the para-arterial space from flooding the brain tissue is these astrocytes. And so astrocytes position their end feet, so these guys, along literally the entirety of the para-arterial space. And in doing so, they serve as a barrier for the diffusion of CSF into the brain tissue. So what becomes really crucial then are these channels, and they're called aquaporin 4 channels. And astrocytes can kind of transcriptionally regulate how many aquaporin channels they're inserting into the membrane of their end feet. And in doing so, they're also regulating how many pathways exist for the CSF to exit the para-arterial space. So that is why astrocytes are the star of the show for the glymphatic system. They modulate how much fluid moves out of the para-arterial space, and thus how much fluid is moving through the glymphatic system. So with all this being set up, I think it's time to trace the flow of CSF. So you start with CSF in the subarachnoid space. It's going to move down the para-arterial complex and out of one of these aquaporins, let's just say. And now it's in the brain tissue, and it's mixing with what we call interstitial fluid, which is just the fluid that's in the brain tissue, like in the extracellular space. I think the most fundamental aspect of the glymphatic system is that wherever you have an artery in the CNS or in the brain, you have a vein in very close proximity. So what that sets up is a situation that really lets the brain take advantage of just normal fluid dynamics. So now you have a source of fluid in the para-arterial space, and you have a sink for that same fluid in the paravenous space. Remember, the paravenous space is also just pia mater invaginated, and it also has its own CSF flowing through it. So that the source and the sink in close proximity causes a convective flow of this fluid across this brain area. And that convective flow is what carries these debris molecules with it into the paravenous space. And the paravenous space clears out into the lymphatic system down here. It's going to hopefully let whatever these debris molecules are, it's going to help them be broken down by cells further along the lymph nodes. So that right there is the glymphatic system. Fluid moves out of the para-arterial space, and a convective current carries it into the paravenous space, and along the entire way, debris is cleared in the brain tissue that fluid is moving through. Cool. So there's a few other things in the figure that are worth noting, and that is that this guy right here is very intentionally depicted as fast asleep. And that's because a multitude of studies now have shown that the glymphatic system is working at its best. It's clearing debris the fastest when people are in deep sleep, so stages 3 and 4. And that right there opens up a question of sleep deprivation and what that does to the brain. And there's a growing body of literature that shows that sleep deprivation is actually a very, very strong risk factor for diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, which are caused by extracellular aggregates in the brain. So if you have less glymphatic clearance, you have a buildup of amyloid beta fibers and other extracellular proteins that underlie these neurological disorders because they cause inflammation in the brain, and that leads to the cognitive deficits and dementias. So that's why I think the glymphatic system is kind of going to stay in the limelight. It's been relatively clarified over the last decade. So most of what we know comes from the last decade, and I don't think it's going anywhere because it is basically the brain's garbage disposal system. And that garbage disposal system is crucial for clearing out all the pathogenic proteins that build up for the neurodegenerative disorders that are becoming more common as the baby boomers age. So for that reason, the glymphatic system is important. Keep an eye out for it, and like and subscribe if you like this video because there's more coming. And I hope you learned something today. Thank you.